They called me washed up. Right there in the backyard, sweet tea in hand, laughing. They said I'd wasted 22 years playing soldier. Said I came home with nothing. Not one of them knew what June the 14th actually cost me. Then a chaplain walked across that lawn, dress uniform, folder in his hand. He read a date out loud, the same date my sister had used against me for 14 years. The yard went dead silent. Not quiet, silent. My sister's smile did not come back. Not that day. Not for weeks. 3 weeks later, the house she swore was hers alone got a yellow notice stapled to the door. I never raised my voice. Not once. I didn't need to. But before the chaplain, there was just a paper plate. And a joke that wasn't really a joke. The paper plate was still warm in my hand when my sister Pat lifted her sweet tea to the whole backyard. She told them I'd wasted 22 years playing soldier. She said it easy, like she was mentioning rain coming later. A few cousins laughed. My brother-in-law laughed loudest. He'd never worn a uniform in his life. I set my plate down on the folding table next to the potato salad. I didn't raise my voice. I don't get loud. I get accurate. 22 years, I said. That's the number. If anyone's counting. Pat waved a hand, like swatting a fly. Nobody's counting, Dana. We just don't need you reminding us every 4th of July. My name is Dana Pruitt. I'm 44 years old. I spent 22 years in the United States Army. Until that afternoon, my own family thought I did paperwork. I walked to the smoker at the edge of the yard. Somebody had to. It kept my hands busy while Pat kept talking. The dial read 410 degrees, 40 degrees too hot, climbing. I opened the vent halfway, checked the coals, closed the lid without a word. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever notices the thing that would have ruined dinner if I hadn't fixed it first. Marlow, Tennessee sits in the shadow of Fort Campbell. Close enough you hear the Blackhawks on quiet mornings. Far enough, most folks forget the base is even there. Bracken Street is 2 blocks of low brick ranch houses, chain-link fences. Our father's house sits at the end of it, white paint gone gray at the corners, a carport with a bent aluminum post. Pat had lived there 11 years, since Dad's health started failing. By the time he died in 2021, she'd made herself the only Pruitt anyone in Marlow thought still mattered. She corrected me on a date again, Pat said to our cousin Loretta, rolling her eyes like I'd committed a small crime. I said Mom's surgery was in March. Dana said February, like it changes anything. It was February 11th, I said. I remember because I called from a payphone at Ramstein. Pat's mouth flattened, just half a second. Then the smile climbed back up. See, this is what I mean, she said. Always so precise. Some of us just live our lives, Dana. We don't need a paper trail. I picked my plate back up. Baked beans, a slice of white bread, corn nobody buttered right. I ate standing near the fence. The folding chairs were full of people who hadn't spoken to me since Easter. I was 19 when I signed my name at a recruiting station in Clarksville. I didn't want another year working the register at the Marlow Feed and Farm, watching my father get quieter every winter after Mom passed. I never told this family what I actually did over there. Not because it was secret, not the way people think of secret, because nobody in Marlow asked. And after enough years of not being asked, you stop offering. My phone buzzed against my hip. I stepped past the smoker, out of earshot, and looked at the screen. A number I didn't have saved. Kentucky area code. I let it ring twice more before I answered. Walking further from the noise of the yard. Colonel Pruitt. Nobody had called me that in 3 years. Not since retirement. Not since the discharge paperwork and the quiet drive home to a town that never asked what the paperwork said. This is Chaplain Boyd, the voice said. Major Russell Boyd. I don't know if you remember me. I remembered him. 14 years is a long time, but some faces don't blur. Not the ones that were there in the worst hour of your life, holding a hand that wasn't going to make it, and one that was. I remember you, Chaplain. I need 10 minutes of your time this week, he said. In person, if you can manage it. It's about the review. What review? I'll explain when I see you, he said. Are you still in Marlow? I told him I was. He said he'd call again Thursday. Then the line went dead. I stood at the edge of my sister's backyard, holding a phone. It had said more to me in 90 seconds than my family said all summer. I went back to the smoker, corrected the vent again, ate my beans cold. That night, I drove the 11 miles back to my rented duplex on the far side of Marlow, the one with the gutter I kept meaning to fix. I did the thing I do maybe twice a year, opened the hall closet, moved the winter coats aside, pulled down my father's old olive footlocker. It still smelled like cedar and gun oil, even after all this time. Inside, folded flat, sat my dress uniform, my medals in their velvet trays. Underneath all of it, an envelope with my name in my father's hand. Earl Pruitt wrote in block capitals. Always had. A habit from 30 years running the parts counter at the Fort Campbell Motor Pool. Dana. That was all the envelope said. I had never opened it. He'd handed it to me himself. The last clear afternoon, before the morphine took the rest of his words. I left something with a friend, he'd said. You'll get it when they finally understand. I didn't know what that meant. I still didn't, not that night. But I knew better than to open a letter from a dying man before its time. My father was careless with a lot of things, money chief among them, but he was never careless with words. If he said wait, I would wait. I put the envelope back exactly where it had been, closed the footlocker, went to bed at 10, the way I have every night since 2019. A body that's carried a rucksack for 2 decades doesn't forgive a late night easily. The next morning, Pat called before 8, her voice bright, the way it gets when she wants something. I need you to help me move some boxes out of Dad's study, she said. For the gala committee. We're storing donation records there now. I thought that room was locked. It's not locked to family, she said. Too quick, just to everyone else. I told her I'd come by Saturday. She hung up before I finished the sentence. Pat had been chair of the Marlow Veterans Memorial Fund for 6 years. Ever since she talked our dying father into naming her executor of what little there was to execute. She wore that title around town like a medal she'd earned. And in fairness, she'd worked for it, in her way. Bake sales, raffle tickets, a gala every October at the Elks Lodge, silent auction, a slideshow of local boys who never made it home. I'd been to exactly one of those galas. Pat had introduced me from the podium as my sister, who also served. The way you'd mention a cousin's minor hobby. I drove to Bracken Street Saturday at noon. Pat met me at the door with a stack of empty banker's boxes, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Just the study, she said. Don't touch anything on the desk. I've got it organized my way. I've spent 22 years being handed instructions by people who outranked me and people who didn't. I've learned to hear the difference between a request and a warning. Pat's voice had the second kind of edge. I carried boxes for 40 minutes. On my third trip down the hall, my phone rang. Chaplain Boyd, right on time. Thursday had slipped without either of us noticing. Can you talk? He asked. Give me a minute. I stepped onto the back porch, out of Pat's sightline, closed the screen door behind me. Go ahead. Colonel, in 2014 you were recommended for a decoration that got downgraded in processing, he said. Administrative error. Paperwork lost in a battalion transfer. It happens more than anyone likes to admit. 4 months ago, a records review flagged the discrepancy. I was asked to weigh in. since I was there. My hand went still on the porch rail. Downgraded from what? From a silver star, he said, to a bronze star with Valor device. The review board just finished its work. It's been corrected. The award stands as originally recommended. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Past the fence, a mower ran 2 yards over, steady, dumb to everything happening in my chest. When? I finally asked. Presentation's being arranged now, he said. I asked to be the one who tells you in person. And I asked for something else too, if you'll allow it. Your father came to me in 2019, before he got sick, asked me to hold something for you. Said you wouldn't want it delivered until, in his words, they finally understand what she actually did. I closed my eyes. There it was, my father's exact phrase, coming out of a stranger's mouth. 14 years and one funeral removed from the man who'd said it to me first. He gave you a letter, I said. He gave me an envelope, Boyd said. I don't know what's in it. I was told to keep it until the correction was final, and give it to you alongside the citation. That day's almost here. I told him I understood. Told him thank you, in the flat way I say most things. Went back inside to keep carrying Pat's boxes. The study wasn't going to empty itself. And I didn't yet know what to do with the size of what I'd just been told. Pat had left the desk uncovered while she ran to answer the door for the mail carrier. Habit is a strange thing. 22 years of reading manifests and shipment logs doesn't turn off just because you retire. My eyes went to the desk before my brain gave permission. I saw, half covered by a church bulletin, a letter with a red stamp across the top. Final notice. Below it, smaller print, a bank's name I recognized from a billboard on the interstate. I didn't touch it. Didn't need to. 22 years of logistics work teaches you to read a manifest upside down from across a room. What I read was enough. An account number, a balance, a date 31 days out. Pat came back in with a stack of catalogs and swept the desk clear before I could look again. You almost done in there? She asked. Too bright. Almost, I said. I finished the boxes, said little on the drive home. That night, lying awake past my usual 10 o'clock, I thought less about the letter's number. I thought more about the tone in Pat's voice. When she'd said just storage, that room had never, in 40 years of my life, needed a lock. The following Tuesday, Chaplain Boyd called again, this time with a date. The presentation would happen at Fort Campbell's Community Hall. September the 14th, open to family. A citation read into the record by the presiding officer. He asked if I wanted my family invited. No, I said, before I'd fully decided it. Then slower. Not yet. Let me handle something first. He didn't ask what. Chaplains learn not to ask what, the same way logistics officers learn not to ask why a convoy commander wants an extra fuel truck. You trust the person who's carried more weight than you have. I drove past Dad's old parts counter that week, the one at the motor pool where he'd worked 30 years before his knees gave out. The building was still there, repainted, new sign out front. I sat in the truck a long while, looking at it anyway. My father taught me 2 things before I ever wore a uniform: how to read an inventory sheet for the lie hidden inside it, and how to keep my voice level once I found one. Both of those had kept soldiers alive, more than once. Neither had ever done me a bit of good with my own sister. I started asking around, quietly. A man I knew from church, Gary Sump, sat on the town council. He mentioned, over coffee, that the county assessor's office had flagged an odd filing on the Bracken Street parcel the year before. A second mortgage. Nobody in town seemed to know about it. I didn't push. I just filed it, the way you file every piece of a manifest, until the whole picture assembles itself. 3 days later, Loretta let something slip at the Piggly Wiggly. Not meaning to. Pat's been asking everybody for gala donations early this year. she said, loading her cart. Said the fund needs a cushion before October. A cushion for what? I asked. Loretta shrugged. You know Pat. Always got a reason. I did not know Pat. Not really. Not anymore. 22 years of distance does that to two sisters who were never especially close to begin with. But I knew numbers, and numbers were starting to whisper the same thing from three different directions. A locked study, a red stamp on a bank letter, and a sudden hunger for early donations. To a fund my sister had run alone for 6 years, with nobody looking over her shoulder. I called Chaplain Boyd back on a Thursday evening. I want the family there, I said. September 14th. All of them. You said not yet, he reminded me. I've had time to think, I said. Bring the letter too. Whatever Dad left. He was quiet a second. You're sure? I don't get loud, I said. I get accurate. And it's time somebody in that family got accurate with me. The days between that call and the 14th moved slow. The way they do before a deployment. Everything ordinary and heavy at once. I went to the community center in Clarksville and requested my own personnel file. The full one. The kind civilians don't know they're entitled to ask for. I sat in a records office for 3 hours, reading dates I already knew by heart, matching them against a mental calendar I'd built without meaning to. June the 14th, 2009. That was the date on the original recommendation, the one that had sat lost in a filing cabinet for 14 years before somebody finally found it. I remembered June the 14th without needing the file. I remembered the smell of diesel, the particular gray of smoke against a Kandahar sky. I remembered going back twice for men who were not supposed to make it, and I remembered 3 weeks later waking up in a combat hospital in Landstuhl, with my own arm in a sling I hadn't noticed getting. What I had not known, not until Loretta mentioned it 2 months earlier, was this. That week was the exact week Pat had spent years telling people something false. She said I had gone quiet on the family. She said I had stopped caring enough to call. She'd built a whole story around my silence that summer. She had never once asked why I'd gone quiet. She had simply decided the answer that made her look best. I did not confront her with any of it. Not the mortgage, not the fund, not the story she'd told about my silence. I let her keep telling it, because the day was coming when somebody else would tell the true version, in a room full of people, and I intended for her to hear it standing up. I thought often in those weeks about the difference between the woman my sister believed she knew, the woman standing quietly beside her at every family gathering, refilling water pitchers, fixing smokers, correcting small dates nobody else cared to get right. 22 years is a long time to be underestimated by the people who share your own blood. I had grown so used to it that I sometimes forgot it wasn't simply how the world worked. It was, I came to understand, only how Pat's version of the world worked. Pat's version had never once been the whole truth. Not about the house, not about the fund, certainly not about me. 2 days before the ceremony, I drove out to the storage records office, pulled the actual assessor filing myself, the one Gary Sump had only mentioned in passing. Second mortgage, recorded 14 months earlier. $41,000 against a house our father had owned free. Clear since 1994. I read the signature line twice. Pat's alone. Not our father's, not any co-signer, just Pat. Dated the same month she'd told the whole family the fund needed a quiet cushion year. I did not tell her I'd seen it. I folded the copy into my jacket pocket, the same pocket where my father's envelope would ride 2 days later. I drove home past the old feed store where I used to work the register at 17, thinking about how long a family can go without anyone checking the math. That Friday, my supply sergeant instincts got the better of me one more time. I called the county recorder's office directly, asked, plainly, whether any liens or judgments had been filed against the Marlowe Veterans Memorial Fund itself, separate from the house. The clerk, a woman named Sandra who remembered my father from his motor pool days, put me on hold for 6 minutes, came back with an answer I'd half expected: 2 vendor invoices, unpaid 11 months, totaling nearly $9,000, both addressed to Pat directly as fund chair. I wrote the number down on the back of an envelope and did not call Pat about it either. Some numbers you save for a room, not a phone call. A week after the storage office call, Pat invited me to a family dinner at her house, ordinary on its surface: meatloaf, green beans, and a store-bought pie. The kind of Sunday dinner we'd shared 100 times without either of us ever quite enjoying it. I decided, halfway through the meal, to test the water a little, the way you'd probe a structure you suspected was failing before you committed weight to it. "How's the fund doing this year?" I asked, cutting my meatloaf with more attention than it required. "Gala season's coming up fast." Pat's fork paused over her plate for half a second, so brief I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching for exactly that. "Fine," she said. "Same as always. Busy, but fine." "Heard the gala committee's been reaching out early for donations this year," I said, keeping my voice as flat, idle as I could manage. "That new?" "Just being proactive," Pat said. "Nothing wrong with proactive." Mark, across the table, said nothing, but I watched him watch her. The way a man watches a wife he suspects is carrying something he hasn't been told the full size of yet. "How's the house holding up?" I asked, reaching for the green beans. "Roof still good, since that storm in the spring?" "The house is fine, Dana," Pat said, sharper now, the performance cracking at its edges. "Why all the questions tonight?" "No reason," I said. "Just making conversation. Isn't that what family dinners are for?" She didn't answer that directly. She changed the subject to Tyler's football schedule instead, too quickly. The way people change subjects when a conversation has gotten closer to something true than they were prepared for. I let her change it. I had learned what I came to learn, which was simply this: my sister was afraid, had been afraid for a while, was working very hard to keep that fear from showing at her own dinner table. I drove home from that dinner, turning the whole exchange over, feeling something close to sympathy underneath the calculation. The way you can feel for an opponent's exhaustion, even while you continue moving your own pieces into position. Fear does that to a person. It makes them sharp in the wrong places and brittle in all the ones that used to hold firm. 3 weeks before the ceremony, I drove down to the American Legion post on the edge of Marlowe to see an old friend, a retired first sergeant named Walt Enders, who'd served 2 tours alongside me at Fort Campbell before a bad knee ended his career early. Walt tends bar there most Saturdays, more for company than money. He's one of maybe 3 people in this whole town who ever knew the shape of what I actually did overseas. "Chaplain Boyd called me too," Walt said, wiping down the bar top before I'd even sat. "Wanted to confirm some dates for the file. Man's thorough." "He tell you about the letter?" "Just that your daddy left one," Walt said. "Didn't say what's in it. Wouldn't be his to say." I told Walt about Pat, about the mortgage, about the fund. He listened the way he always has, without interrupting. The same patience he'd shown carrying a stretcher corner in 2009 while I worked on the man beside him. "You remember Delgado," Walt said, when I'd finished. "Kid from the truck. He's got 3 kids of his own now, out in Kentucky. Sends me a card every Christmas. Never once mentions the leg he almost lost. Just says thank you for the ride home." I hadn't heard Delgado's name spoken by anyone but Boyd in 14 years. Hearing it twice in 1 month, from 2 different men who'd stood closer to that morning than I sometimes let myself remember. settled something in my chest that I didn't have a word for yet. Your sister ever ask you about that day? Walt said, straight out. Ever ask what happened? Not once, I said. In 14 years. Walt shook his head slow. Some families don't ask because they're scared of the answer. Some don't ask because they've already decided they don't want one that complicates the story they're telling themselves. I've known Pat since she was a girl. I think it's the second kind, with her. I sat with that a long while, nursing a beer I'd barely touched, listening to the jukebox cycle through songs older than either of us. Walt refilled my water without being asked, an old habit from 100 mess halls. Told me, before I left, that he'd be at the ceremony himself, front row if they'd let him, because a debt like that doesn't stay quiet forever. He wanted to be there when it finally spoke. I drove home that night past the fairgrounds again, for the first time since Boyd's call. I let myself feel something closer to peace than dread about what Saturday would hold. The following week, I stopped by the Fort Campbell Records office one more time, mostly out of the same habit that had me checking the smoker vent at every barbecue whether anyone asked me to or not. I wanted to see the full timeline laid out once, plainly, before I stood in a room, heard it read by someone else. The clerk pulled the file without much ceremony. A woman younger than my own sons would have been if I'd had any. Laid it flat on the counter between us. Enlistment, October 2001. Basic training, Fort Jackson. Advanced training, Fort Lee. Transportation management, honor graduate. First assignment, Fort Campbell, 2002. First deployment, Iraq, 2003 through 2004. Convoy security and fuel logistics. Sergeant, 2005. Second deployment, 2006 through 2007. Staff Sergeant, 2008. Third deployment, Kandahar Province, beginning January 2009. June the 14th sat in that file the same way it sat in my memory. A single dense paragraph among hundreds of pages of ordinary service. Easy to miss if you didn't know exactly where to look. The whole truth of a person can sit folded inside a filing cabinet for 14 years. Meanwhile, the people who love them build an entirely different story out of the silence around it. Sergeant First Class, 2013. First Sergeant, 2015. Commissioned, 2017. Lieutenant Colonel by 2019. A final assignment training young officers at Fort Drum, 2019 through 2021. The same window my father's health began its last decline. Retirement, honorable, full benefits, 22 years total, in the spring of 2021, 3 weeks before he died. I signed for a copy of the full record, drove home with it on the passenger seat, past the feed store, past the parts counter, past every landmark in this town that had watched a girl leave at 19, come home, 22 years later, into a family that still called it playing soldier. 2 weeks before the ceremony, Pat threw a smaller cookout, just family, to celebrate her older son making the Clarksville football team. I almost didn't go. I went anyway, because I don't skip the things that matter to those boys, whatever their mother says about me at the folding table. Pat was in rare form that afternoon, loud with relief, the way people get when they've convinced themselves a problem has quietly gone away on its own. She'd sold 24 extra gala tickets that week, she announced to the yard, enough to put the fund back on solid ground before October. Nobody but me understood what solid ground she was actually measuring against. You should come to the gala this year, Dana, she said, refilling glasses. Might do you good, being around people who actually give back to this town. I give back, I said. I just don't sell raffle tickets to do it. She laughed, a little too bright. There she goes again, always so precise. Mark, standing near the grill, said something I wasn't meant to hear, but heard anyway. "Long as the numbers work out this time," he muttered to his brother. Low enough that Pat didn't catch it, but I did. I filed that too. A husband who doubted his own wife's numbers is not a small thing in a marriage that's supposed to be a united front. Later that same afternoon, Pat cornered me by the cooler. Her voice dropped to something almost gentle, almost honest. "I know you think I don't appreciate what you did over there," she said. "I do. I just I grew up watching Dad worry about you every deployment. I got tired of being the one who stayed and never got noticed for it." It was, I think, the closest thing to truth Pat had ever handed me. I almost told her everything right there: the mortgage, the invoices, the compliance flag circling closer every week. I didn't. Some truths need a witness bigger than a cooler full of ice. Two sisters who've spent 40 years measuring each other. "I know staying is hard too," I said instead. I never said it wasn't. She nodded, surprised, like she'd expected an argument and gotten something else. Then Loretta called her away to deal with a spilled drink. The moment closed the way most moments between Pat. Me eventually close, half finished, waiting for a better room. The following Monday, Carol Whitfield's compliance review moved from routine to formal. Gary Sump heard it first, from a clerk at the courthouse who mentioned, off the record, that the county had requested 3 years of the fund's bank statements rather than the usual one. That is not a small request. That is the kind of request that comes after somebody higher up has already seen a number that troubled them. I did not call Pat with the news. I let the county's own machinery keep turning, the way I'd let it turn from the start, because truth arrives faster, lands harder when it's not carried by a sister with a grudge people could dismiss as petty. That Wednesday, 10 days before the ceremony, the foreclosure notice I'd glimpsed weeks earlier on Pat's desk finally ran its full course. The bank filed formally at the county courthouse, a public record anyone could pull for the asking. Gary told me the filing listed a balance of $41,600, plus fees, against a house our father had bought outright in 1994 for $38,000 total. Pat had borrowed more against it in 14 months than our parents had spent building it over a lifetime. I sat with that number a long while. $41,600. It sat next to the $9,000 in unpaid fund invoices, the 24 extra gala tickets Pat had sold to cover a hole she still hadn't admitted to anyone, not even, I suspected, to herself. Thursday, Chaplain Boyd called with an update of his own. The Army's Public Affairs Office at Fort Campbell had asked, given the age, rarity of a 14-year correction case, whether they could invite the base newspaper to cover the ceremony as a human interest piece. I said yes before I'd fully thought through what that meant. Only realized afterward that a reporter in the room meant Pat's reaction, whatever it turned out to be, would happen in front of more witnesses than I'd originally planned for. That same night, Pat called me again, later than usual, close to 11. "I talked to a lawyer today," she said, her voice smaller than the version I'd heard at the cookout, "about the house. He said things I didn't like hearing." "What kind of things?" "That waiting doesn't fix a balance," she said, "that the fund's books need to be clean before the county finishes looking, or it stops being a mistake, starts being something else. Dana, I don't know what I'm going to do." I thought about the smoker, 40 degrees too hot. How nobody ever notices the thing that would have ruined dinner until somebody quietly fixes it. I thought about 22 years of small corrections handed back to me at every family table. I thought about my father's letter, still waiting, still sealed, 3 days from finally being read. "Come Saturday," I said, "to the thing at Fort Campbell. Whatever else is happening, come to that first." Why does that matter more than the house right now? Because some things get fixed with paperwork, I said, and some things only get fixed by finally hearing the truth out loud, in front of people who matter. You need both, Pat. I think Saturday gives you the second one. She didn't understand what I meant. I didn't explain further. Some things a person has to sit inside before they understand them. The way I'd had to sit inside 14 years of silence before a chaplain's phone call finally explained it to me. Friday, the day before the ceremony. Carol Whitfield's office sent Pat formal notice that the fund's financial review would proceed to a full audit, with findings expected within 90 days. Loretta told me Pat cried in her car in the church parking lot that afternoon, the first time anyone had seen her cry in years. I did not go to her. I let her sit with it a while longer, the way you let a soldier sit with bad news before you hand them the next order. Because sometimes a person needs the weight to fully land before they're ready to carry anything new. That night, I laid my dress uniform out on the bed, checked the ribbons against the order I remembered, set my father's citation folder. The copy Boyd had sent ahead for my records, on the nightstand beside it. I did not sleep well. I don't think I was supposed to. 4 days before the ceremony. Pat asked me to come by Bracken Street one more time, to help her sort through what she called some old files for the fund's upcoming audit. I said yes, the way I always said yes to Pat, because some habits outlast even 14 years of small cruelties. She left me alone in the study longer than she meant to, called away by a phone call from the fund's accountant that stretched into 20 minutes on the back porch. I sat at our father's old desk, the same desk where I'd once done homework as a girl. I let my eyes do what they'd wanted to do for weeks. The banker's boxes Pat had asked me to carry months earlier sat stacked against the far wall, lids half open. I did not go looking through them uninvited, but one folder sat directly on top of the nearest box, unlabeled. My hand found it before my better judgment caught up. Inside were photocopies of 2 years of fund bank statements. Several transactions circled in Pat's own handwriting. Red pen, the same red pen she'd used to correct my school papers as a girl. 3 withdrawals in particular caught my eye. Each one moved from the fund's account into a personal account on the same day, each one roughly matching a mortgage payment amount I recognized from the assessor's filing I'd already seen. I did not take the folder. I photographed 3 pages with my phone, quickly, the way you document a discrepancy in the field before someone moves the evidence. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, corners aligned. The unlabeled folder returned to the same angle atop the same box. Pat came back in a few minutes later, her eyes red, though she tried to hide it. "Everything all right out there?" I asked. "Accountant wants 3 years of statements by Friday," she said. "I don't know how I'm going to pull all that together in time." "I could help," I said, which was true, and also not the whole truth, since I already held photographs of exactly the pages she most needed help explaining. "You'd do that? After everything I've said to you?" "You're still my sister," I said. "That doesn't stop being true just because you've said some things I didn't like hearing." She hugged me then. Quick. Awkward. The first hug I could remember from her in years. I let myself feel it without letting myself forget what sat in my phone's camera roll. That Thursday night, I called Chaplain Boyd one final time before the ceremony and told him what I'd found. Not to change anything about Saturday's plan, but because I wanted someone outside the family to know the full shape of what was coming. In case Pat's audit collapsed faster than anyone expected once the county's own reviewers found what I already had. "That's not something I can act on," Boyd said carefully. "I'm not law enforcement, and neither are you. But I hear you, Colonel. And for what it's worth, I think your father would tell you the same thing I'm about to." Let the institutions do their job. You've already done yours, just by refusing to look away. I'm not trying to bury her, I said. I want that understood. I know, Boyd said. 14 years of watching how you carry yourself tells me exactly what kind of correction you're after. It's not the kind that needs anyone's blood in the water. I want to go back further, before any of this started moving. Tell you plainly what those 22 years actually held, because the family never asked. I think you deserve the parts they never bothered to hear. I enlisted in 2001, the fall after the towers fell, 19 years old, angry in a way I didn't have words for yet. Basic training at Fort Jackson, advanced individual training in transportation management at Fort Lee. My first assignment, Fort Campbell itself, 12 miles from the house I grew up in, close enough that my father could drive over on weekends, pretend he wasn't worried sick every time my unit deployed. My first tour was 2003, convoy operations in Iraq, moving fuel. Ammunition along roads that weren't safe in daylight and weren't safer at night. I made sergeant in 2005. I made staff sergeant in 2008, the year before Kandahar. The year before June the 14th changed the shape of everything that came after it. I want to say plainly what the citation only says in careful Army language. Our convoy hit a pressure plate device just after dawn, followed within 90 seconds by small arms fire from a tree line we hadn't cleared the night before. The fuel truck at the rear of our column took the worst of it. 2 soldiers were trapped inside the cab, one with a shattered leg, one unconscious from the blast. I do not talk about the smell of a burning fuel truck to people who haven't smelled one. I will say only that I went back twice, that both times I told myself it would be the last time. Both times it wasn't, until both men were clear and secured. My arm took shrapnel on the second trip. I did not know it at the time. Adrenaline does that. I finished the extraction, helped stabilize both soldiers for the medevac, only sat down once the birds were in the air, at which point somebody noticed the blood soaking through my sleeve, made me sit still long enough to be looked at properly. I spent 3 weeks at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, healing an arm that still aches before rain, some 14 years later. I called home twice from that hospital, both times on a borrowed satellite phone with a 2-minute limit. Both times to my father, because my mother had already passed and Pat, by then 24, newly married, had made it clear over the years that military talk bored her. Neither of those 2-minute calls mentioned an ambush, a burning truck, or an arm full of shrapnel. I told my father I was fine, that the mission was routine, because that is what you tell a father whose heart already worried too much. Because operational security in 2009 meant you didn't discuss specifics on any line. You couldn't guarantee was secure. My father, I would learn only 14 years later, had somehow pieced together more of the truth than I ever gave him credit for. That silence, those 2 clipped phone calls, became the entire foundation of the story Pat built, told for the next 14 years. That the summer of 2009 was the summer I stopped calling enough, stopped caring enough, chose the Army over my own family in some cold, deliberate way she never let anyone forget. She was not lying exactly. She simply never asked the one question that would have unmade the whole story. Why was I so quiet that particular summer? She decided the answer that flattered her. She kept deciding it for 14 years, at every reunion, every holiday, every backyard barbecue since. I came home in 2010, finished a second tour in Regional Command East in 2011, made Sergeant First Class in 2013, was recommended for the Silver Star that same year. A records review flagged it, though nobody in my chain of command explained it clearly at the time. I was told only that the paperwork was in process. Paperwork stays in process for a long time in an army as large as ours. I had learned not to ask twice about things above my pay grade. I made first sergeant in 2015, then earned a battlefield commission review that led to officer status by 2017. An unusual path, but not an unheard one for senior non-commissioned officers with the right combination of scores. Recommendations. I finished my career as a lieutenant colonel, promoted to full colonel in a brevet capacity during my final training assignment at Fort Drum, teaching logistics doctrine to young officers who had no idea, most of them, that their instructor had once dragged two men out of a burning fuel truck on the worst morning of her life. I retired in 2021, the same spring my father's heart gave out for the last time. I flew home for the funeral in my dress uniform, the only time I'd worn it in Marlow in over a decade. Pat, arranging the reception afterward, asked me quietly to change into something less military before the guests arrived, because she worried it would make the day. In her words, too much about you. I changed. I did not argue. I have spent a great deal of my life choosing not to argue. I am no longer entirely sure that was wisdom rather than exhaustion. At the funeral itself, before the reception, before Pat's request about the uniform, my father's casket sat at the front of a small chapel 2 blocks from Bracken Street, flanked by 2 folded flags I'd arranged through the honor guard detail at Fort Campbell, a courtesy extended to veterans, their immediate families. Pat had questioned the expense of that detail out loud to Loretta, not realizing I'd covered the cost myself, quietly, the way I'd covered a great many things over the years without ever mentioning it at a single family dinner. I remember standing at that casket a long while, alone, before the other mourners arrived, thinking about a man who had spent his whole life running a parts counter, raising 2 daughters who turned out to need entirely different things from him. Pat needed his attention and his praise, spoken loud and often. I needed only his patience and his willingness to wait, and it turned out, though I did not know it yet, that he had given me something far larger than either of us understood that day. A promise kept in a chaplain's keeping, waiting for its own proper season. The honor guard folded the flag with careful precision. I'd seen that same precision at a dozen other funerals for soldiers under my own command. 13 creases, each one deliberate, presented it to Pat as the elder child, a custom neither of us had thought to question at the time. She held it the whole reception, unsure what to do with an object that heavy. I remember watching her struggle with it, thinking, even then, that grief has a way of exposing exactly how little we understand the people we claim to love best. All of that, the pressure plate device, the burning truck, the 2 men I carried out, the 3 weeks at Landstuhl, 22 years of a career my own sister reduced to playing soldier, desk job, paperwork, sat behind every single conversation I had with my family for over a decade, unspoken. Because nobody in Marlow ever asked. I had stopped offering a long time before that barbecue. I tell you this now because it matters for what came next. Because when Chaplain Boyd finally stood at that podium, read the true account aloud, he was not telling the room something new. He was only telling them something true that had been sitting whole, complete, inside me the entire time, waiting for someone with the standing to say it out loud in a room that couldn't argue with it. The Tuesday before the ceremony, 3 days out. I drove to Fort Campbell to meet Chaplain Boyd in person for the first time in 14 years. We sat in a small office near the community hall, coffee going cold between us. He told me things about that morning in Kandahar that I had never known, because I'd been too busy surviving it to notice the parts other people carried. I held Private Delgado's hand the whole ride to the aid station, he said. He kept asking if you'd made it back out. I told him yes every time, before I even knew for certain myself. I didn't know that, I said. There's a lot you don't know, Boyd said. Your father found some of it out years later, when Delgado's family reached out to thank the unit at a reunion event. He heard your name mentioned by strangers who called you a hero. I think that's the day he decided your own family needed to hear it too. Eventually, properly, not secondhand. I sat with that a long moment. My father, at some veterans event I'd never attended, hearing a stranger call his daughter a hero, while his other daughter called her a washout at every table back home. He asked me something else, near the end. Boyd said. He asked me to make sure, whenever this correction finally came through, that it happened in a room with your family in it, not a quiet mailed letter. A room. He was very specific about that. Why? He didn't say directly, Boyd said, but I think he'd spent a long time watching your sister build a story in public, at every gathering, in front of everyone who mattered in this town. I think he wanted the truth corrected in the same kind of room, not to humiliate her, to simply put the record where everyone could finally see it plainly. I thought about that the whole drive home. My father, dying, arranging not a punishment, but a correction. The way you'd fix an inventory count that had been wrong for years, quietly, patiently, waiting for the paperwork to finally catch up to the truth. That Wednesday night, 2 days before the ceremony, Pat called me one final time before Saturday. This call was different from the others. Her voice had lost the brightness entirely. The lawyer says the audit will probably take 3 months, she said. He says if it comes back clean, mostly clean, I might keep the house with a payment plan. If it doesn't, she didn't finish the sentence. I let the silence sit, the way I'd learned to let silence sit in rooms far heavier than this one. I keep thinking about something you said, she went on, that some things only get fixed by the truth, out loud, in a room. I don't know what you meant by that, but I keep thinking about it. You'll understand Saturday, I said. Are you punishing me, Dana? Is that what Saturday is? I thought about that question longer than she probably expected. No, I said finally. Saturday isn't about you at all. It's about something that's been sitting wrong for 14 years, and it's finally getting put right. What you do with the room after that is entirely your own business. She was quiet again, and then, so softly I almost missed it. I've been scared for months. I didn't know how to say that to anyone. I know, I said. I could see it. Since when do you see anything about me? Since always, I said. I just don't get loud about what I notice. I get accurate instead. We hung up not long after that, neither of us having said everything, both of us having said more than we usually did. I lay awake a long while that night, thinking about a sister I hadn't fully seen in years, a father who had spent his last months quietly arranging a room where the truth could finally do its work, without anyone having to raise their voice. The morning of September the 14th arrived cool and clear, the kind of Tennessee morning where the humidity finally breaks. Everybody in Marlow talks about it like a small miracle. I wore my dress uniform for the first time in 3 years. It still fit, more or less, though I'd had to let the waistband out a notch since retirement. I looked at myself in the mirror longer than I meant to. 44 years old, 22 of them in green. Not one photograph of me in this uniform hanging anywhere in my sister's house. I drove to Bracken Street first. I wanted them to ride over together, the way a family is supposed to. Pat answered the door already annoyed, already running late for something at the fund office. What is this? She said, looking at the uniform. There's an event at Fort Campbell today, I said. I'd like you and Mark and the kids to come. What kind of event? A presentation, I said. It concerns Dad. That was enough to get her moving. Pat has never in her life turned down a chance to be part of something that concerns Dad, especially in public, especially where people might be watching. She gathered her husband, her two teenage sons, Loretta and her family, and half the funds committee besides, because Pat cannot resist an audience. And I had made sure, quietly, weeks in advance, that two members of that committee would be there specifically. The Saturday before the ceremony, I had dinner with Loretta, her husband Dale at the Cracker Barrel off the interstate. The kind of dinner that starts as small talk, ends up somewhere neither of us planned. "You've been asking a lot of questions," Loretta said, halfway through her chicken and dumplings. "Around town, about Pat." "Have I?" "Gary Sump told Dale you asked about the assessor's office," she said. "And Sandra at the recorder's office mentioned you called about liens. Small town, Dana. Everybody tells everybody." I set my fork down. I'm not trying to hurt her. "Then what are you trying to do?" "I'm trying to be accurate," I said. "That's all I've ever tried to do." Loretta studied me a long moment. "You know she's scared, right? Whatever you found, she already knows something's wrong. She's been asking people for money like she's bailing water out of a boat." That was the first time anyone had said it plainly. I thought about the red stamp on the desk, the second mortgage with only Pat's signature, the two vendor invoices, unpaid 11 months, $9,000 owed in the fund's own name. "How scared?" I asked. "Scared enough that Mark's been sleeping at his brother's twice a week," Loretta said. "Scared enough she snapped at the pastor for asking when the gala tickets would go on sale. That's not Pat. Pat loves that gala more than she loves most people." I drove home that night turning the numbers over like a manifest I couldn't reconcile. 41,000 on the house, 9,000 on the fund, a gala 6 weeks out that she needed desperately to look like a triumph, because a failed gala would draw exactly the kind of attention she could least afford. 2 days after that dinner, Gary Sump called me again, this time with something new: the county's Veterans Affairs liaison. A woman named Carol Whitfield, who oversaw grant disbursements to small nonprofits across 3 counties, had flagged Marlowe's fund for a routine compliance check after noticing a spike in last-minute donation solicitations, the kind that sometimes signal a fund trying to cover a hole before an audit finds it. Carol wasn't accusing anyone of anything yet. She was only asking questions, the same way I'd been asking questions. Except her questions came with subpoena power if they needed it. "She doesn't know I called you," Gary said. "This is just neighbors talking, but I thought you should know before Thursday." I thanked him and hung up. I sat at my kitchen table a long while with a legal pad, writing out everything I knew in the order I'd learned it, the way I used to write out a supply manifest before a convoy rolled, because a plan only holds if you can see the whole shape of it at once. Second mortgage, 41,000, Pat's signature alone, 14 months old. Fund invoices unpaid, 9,000, 11 months overdue. Early donation push, unusual for 6 weeks before the gala. Compliance flag from the county, routine for now but moving. Foreclosure clock on the house, 31 days from the notice I'd glimpsed, now down to roughly 11. I looked at that list a long time. It did not look like a woman managing a difficult year. It looked like a woman who had been quietly drowning for longer than anyone in the family had bothered to notice, mostly because Pat had spent so many years making sure nobody looked past the surface she presented. I thought about calling her that night and saying all of it out loud, ending the waiting, ending the plan. I didn't. Some part of me, the part that had spent 22 years learning patience under fire, understood that timing matters as much as truth does. Say the wrong thing on the wrong night, and a scared person digs in deeper. Say it in the right room, in front of the right witnesses, and a scared person sometimes finally stops running. That Wednesday, 3 days before the ceremony, Pat called me at 9 at night, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard since our mother's funeral. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to be honest." "I'm always honest," I said. "It's the one thing you've always known about me." "Have you been talking to people about the house?" I let the question sit a second. "I've heard some things around town. I haven't gone looking for trouble, Pat." "There's no trouble," she said too fast, the same way she'd said just storage weeks before. "It's just a rough patch. The fun's fine. The house is fine. I've got it handled." "Okay," I said. "That's it? Okay? What do you want me to say?" She was quiet a long moment. "I want you to say you'll help me if it comes to that. I know I haven't always. I know I say things." I thought about the smoker, the beans gone cold, 22 years of just paperwork, playing soldier, every small public correction she'd handed me at every family table since I came home the first time. I thought about my father's letter, still unopened in Chaplain Boyd's keeping, waiting for a day when somebody in this family finally understood. "I'll be there Saturday," I said. "That's the truest thing I can tell you right now." She didn't push further. We hung up. I sat with the phone warm in my hand a long while, wondering if she had any idea what Saturday actually held. Thursday morning, Chaplain Boyd called one more time before the ceremony to confirm logistics, to ask gently whether I'd read my father's letter yet. "I'm keeping it for Saturday," I said. Seemed right, somehow. To open it the same day the record gets fixed. "He'd have liked that," Boyd said. "He talked about you more than you'd think, those last months. Always the same phrase. Accurate, not loud." I asked him, because I'd been wondering since our first call, why my father had trusted a chaplain he'd only known a short while with something that mattered so much. "He didn't trust me because he knew me well," Boyd said. "He trusted me because I was there on June the 14th. I held one of those soldiers' hands while you went back the second time. Your father found that out somehow, years later, and he tracked me down just to thank me for being there. Then he asked if I'd hold something for you, someday. I said yes before he even told me why. I didn't have words for that right away. I just said thank you again, the flat way I say most things, and told him I'd see him Saturday." Friday night, the night before the ceremony, I couldn't sleep. So I drove out past the old fairgrounds where Dad used to take me, Pat as kids, back before either of us knew what the other one would become. The gate was chained for the season, the midway dark, but I sat in the truck a long while, looking at the Ferris wheel's black silhouette against the sky, remembering a version of my sister who used to hold my hand crossing the parking lot, back before either of us had learned to keep score. I thought about what Loretta said, that Pat was scared enough to be sleeping badly, snapping at pastors, drowning quietly in a hole she'd dug herself. I thought about the version of me that might have wanted to watch her fall all the way down. I made myself sit with that feeling honestly, the way you sit with any dangerous impulse in a war zone, acknowledging it without acting on it. I did not want Pat destroyed. I wanted the truth spoken once, clearly, in a room that couldn't be argued with. What happened after that would be up to her, and up to the county, and up to whatever came next. That was the difference, I decided. Driving home past midnight, between what I was about to do, what 22 years of Pat's small cruelties might have earned in a less disciplined person. I don't get loud, I get accurate, and accuracy, once spoken, does not need my help to do its work. That morning, before I drove to Bracken Street, my older nephew Tyler called me, unprompted. The first time he'd ever called me on his own instead of just being handed a phone by his mother. "Aunt Dana," he said, "Mom said there's some army thing today. Is it a big deal?" "It might be," I said. Why do you ask? Coach always says the guys who serve are the toughest guys he knows, Tyler said. I never really thought about you like that. You're just Aunt Dana. You bring the potato salad. I laughed, actually laughed, the first real laugh I'd had in weeks. I can be both things, I said. The potato salad and the other thing. What's the other thing? You'll see today, I said. I promise you'll see. He was quiet a second. Mom always says you were kind of a disappointment. Like not mean, just matter of fact about it. Like it's just a known thing in the family. I felt that land somewhere old and tender, a wound 14 years deep, finding one more small opening. Your mom's been wrong about a few things lately, I said carefully. Today might be one of the days that gets corrected. Corrected how? You'll see, I said again. Wear something nice. This one's worth dressing up for. I hung up, sat in my truck outside my duplex a long moment, thinking about a 15-year-old boy who'd grown up believing his aunt was a known disappointment, a fact as settled in his mind as the color of the sky, simply because nobody had ever bothered to tell him different. I thought, too, about my own 19-year-old self, signing papers at a recruiting station in Clarksville, certain nobody in this family would ever fully understand what that choice would cost or what it would eventually prove. I had been right about the first part for a very long time. I was about to find out, in a matter of hours, whether I'd been wrong about the second. I drove to the dry cleaner first, to pick up my dress uniform, pressed, bagged, exactly the way I'd left instructions 3 days earlier. The woman behind the counter, a soft-spoken widow named Carla, who'd pressed uniforms in this town for 30 years, handed it over with unusual care. Big day? She asked, the way she always did, out of habit more than curiosity. Bigger than most, I said. You always look so put together in this uniform, Carla said. My husband used to say the same thing about his own dress blues. Said it was the only outfit that ever made him stand up straighter without trying. I thought about that the whole drive home. How a uniform doesn't change what's inside a person. It only makes visible, for a few hours, what was true the entire time underneath the ordinary clothes everybody else assumed told the whole story. I laid the uniform across my bed, checked every ribbon against the order card I'd kept since my last formal inspection. 3 years earlier, Combat Action Badge, Bronze Star with Valor Device, soon to be replaced, Army Commendation Medal, 4 awards, Meritorious Service Medal, 2 awards, National Defense Service Medal, Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, Afghanistan Campaign Medal, with 3 campaign stars for 3 separate deployment windows, Iraq Campaign Medal, 2 campaign stars, 22 years compressed into a chest full of small colored ribbons that most of my own family had never once asked me to explain. I pinned each one in careful order. The same order I'd learned as a young sergeant standing inspection under men twice my rank. I looked at myself in the mirror one final time before leaving for Bracken Street. 44 years old. 22 years given to something larger than any one family's small grievances, and for the first time in longer than I could remember. I did not feel like the woman my sister called washed up. I felt simply like myself, fully assembled, for the first time in public in over a decade. I checked my phone once more before starting the truck. A text from Chaplain Boyd, sent at 7 that morning. Whatever happens today, your father would be proud of how you carried this. 10 o'clock. We'll be ready for you. I texted back a single word. Ready. Then I drove to Bracken Street to gather a family that had no idea what the next 3 hours were about to cost them. No idea what it was about to give back to me. The drive to Fort Campbell takes 18 minutes from Bracken Street. Nobody spoke much in the car behind me. I watched them in my mirror the whole way. 4 vehicles strung out along Highway 41. A small parade none of them knew was heading toward anything but a nice morning out. Mark rode with Pat in the lead car. I heard later he asked her twice what the presentation was actually for. Twice she told him she didn't know, which was, for once in a long while, the plain truth. The community hall at Fort Campbell holds maybe 150 chairs, folding metal ones, lined in neat rows under fluorescent lights, a flag at either side of a small stage. It was maybe 2/3 full that afternoon. Active duty families, a scattering of retirees, a few reporters from the base paper, covering it as routine. My family filed into a row near the front, Pat glancing around, calculating who else of importance might be watching. I sat one row behind them, on purpose. I wanted to watch her face, not have her watch mine. A young lieutenant near the aisle recognized my dress blues, the ribbons on my chest, gave me a nod, the kind one soldier gives another without needing words. Pat noticed the nod. I saw her frown at it, confused. File it away the way she files away anything that doesn't fit her version of me. We parked in a gravel overflow lot beside the community hall, close enough to hear the flag lines snapping in the morning wind. Pat sat a moment in her car before getting out, checking her makeup in the visor mirror, smoothing her dress. The same small rituals she performed before every gala, every reunion, every event where she wanted to be seen a certain way. "You could have told me what to wear," she said, stepping out, eyeing my ribbons for the first time in close daylight. "I feel underdressed." "You look fine," I said. "This isn't about how anyone looks." Mark carried a folding umbrella he didn't need, out of some old habit. The boys trailed behind us in their good church clothes, Tyler glancing at me twice like he was still turning our morning phone call over in his head. At the door, a young private checked names against a guest list, directed us toward the family section, 3 rows reserved with small printed cards. Pruitt family, one card read. Pat's hand brushed it as she passed, reading her own name attached to an event she still didn't understand. Inside, the room smelled the way every army building smells, floor wax and old coffee. Something like cold metal underneath it all. A smell I'd carried in my memory since basic training. Never quite lost, even in 22 years of moving between bases 3 time zones apart. I saw 2 of the fund's committee members near the back, exactly where I'd asked Gary Sump to seat them weeks earlier, close enough to witness everything, far enough that Pat wouldn't clock them until it was already happening around her. Carol Whitfield herself sat 2 rows behind, there in an unofficial capacity, curious. Gary told me later about the woman whose fund she'd spent 2 months quietly investigating. Loretta found us near the entrance, hugging Pat first. Then me, holding the hug a beat longer than usual, like she already sensed something in the air that the rest of the family hadn't caught yet. "You look sharp, Dana," she said. "Sharper than I've ever seen you." "Feels different wearing it here," I admitted. "Feels different being seen in it at all." We took our seats as the room filled in around us, families in their own good clothes, veterans in blazers with small pins on their lapels. A scattering of active duty soldiers sat near the front in dress uniform. Only years of formation practice teach a body that kind of stillness. Somewhere behind me, a baby fussed and was quickly hushed. Somewhere ahead, a floor microphone squealed once and was adjusted before the ceremony started. An aide walked the row of family members through a short program handed out on cardstock. I watched Pat read her own copy twice, her lips moving slightly the way they did when she was working hard to understand something she didn't want to understand yet. Her son sat on either side of her, restless the way teenage boys get in folding chairs, until the room's flags The sight of 24 uniforms settled something in them. They went still without being told. Mark leaned toward Pat, asked, low, "Is this about Dana's old job or something?" Pat shushed him without answering, because she genuinely did not know. Not knowing, in a room full of people who clearly did, seemed to unsettle her more than any answer could have. A colonel I'd served under years before opened the ceremony with a short statement about the review process, about administrative corrections, and the Army's commitment to getting the record right, however long it takes. He read a little of the history out loud first. The dry procedural kind, the original 2009 recommendation, misfiled during a battalion transfer to Fort Drum, rediscovered 11 years later during a routine digitization project, finally routed for full review after a young records clerk in Virginia noticed the paperwork didn't match the citation it referenced. 14 years, he said, was not unusual for a case like this, though it was never something the Army was proud of. I watched Pat's face go from bored to mildly interested, somewhere in the middle of that history. The way it does when she realizes an event might actually matter to people whose opinions she cares about. Before my name was called, the colonel recognized two other corrections on the day's docket, smaller ones. A retired specialist whose combat infantry badge had been left off his DD-214 by clerical error 20 years earlier. A widow receiving her late husband's long-delayed Purple Heart on his behalf. Each recognition took its own few minutes, its own quiet applause, its own small crowd of family blinking back tears and folding chairs. The specialist, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Curtis Rowan, stood at attention while the colonel read a short paragraph correcting his record. When it was finished, he saluted so sharply that his own grown daughter, sitting in the front row, put both hands over her mouth. I watched her face, thought of every family member in this hall who had spent years believing an incomplete version of somebody they loved, simply because the paperwork hadn't caught up yet to the truth. The widow came next, a small woman named Evelyn Marsh, walking slowly to the stage with a cane. The colonel presented her late husband's Purple Heart in a case she held against her chest, the way you'd hold something that used to breathe. She said only, "He would have hated all this fuss." The room laughed gently, the good kind of laugh, the kind that makes space for grief without denying it. I watched all of it from my seat, waiting my turn, feeling the particular ache of recognizing my own story reflected twice already before it was even called. Two families discovering, in the space of 10 minutes, that the person they thought they'd fully known still had rooms inside them nobody had opened yet. Pat leaned toward me during the applause for Evelyn Marsh, her voice low, almost pleading. "Dana, is this about you? Is that why we're here?" "Just watch," I said. "You'll understand soon enough." "You're scaring me a little," she admitted. I noted, quietly, that it was the first honest thing she'd said to me all morning. Honest in the specific way fear makes people honest, stripping away the performance long enough for something real to show through. Mark reached over and took her hand again. For a moment, the two of them looked less like the couple who'd spent months hiding a foreclosure notice from the rest of the family, more like two people bracing together for whatever came next, which I suppose in the end is most of what a marriage actually is. The colonel returned to the podium, shuffled his index cards once, looked out over the room with the particular patience of a man who has delivered hard truths, soft ones both, in equal measure, across a long career. "Our final correction today," he said, "concerns an action from June of 2009, one that took an unusually long path back to us." I watched Pat during those two recognitions more than I watched the stage. I watched her read the room, watched her notice how each family reacted, watched the exact moment she began to understand that whatever was coming for our family carried the same weight as what she was witnessing now. Her hand found marks on the armrest between them. For the first time all morning, she stopped glancing around to see who else might be watching her. Walt Enders sat 2 rows back, in a blazer instead of a uniform, since he'd been retired even longer than I had. When our eyes met across the hall, he gave me the smallest nod, the kind two soldiers exchange when they both know exactly what's coming. Neither needs to say it aloud. Then the colonel called my name. "Colonel Dana Pruitt," he said. I watched Pat's spine go straight at the word colonel, a rank she had genuinely never once heard attached to my name in all the years since I'd left for basic training. I stood, walked the few steps to the small stage, took my place beside the podium, facing a room that included every member of my family who had ever called what I did over their paperwork. The colonel spoke a moment before handing the podium to Boyd. The way protocol calls for, a short biographical note read from a card. "Colonel Pruitt enlisted in October of 2001, he said, and served 22 years in transportation, logistics command, with 3 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. She retired in 2021, holding the rank of full colonel, having risen from private to command through both enlisted. Commissioned service, a path fewer than 1 in 100 soldiers ever completes." I heard Tyler whisper something to his brother, too soft to make out. Saw both boys turn to look at me with an expression I had genuinely never seen on either of their faces before. Something between disbelief, a kind of dawning pride they didn't yet have words for. Today, the colonel continued. "We correct a 14-year administrative oversight regarding an action from June of 2009 during Colonel Pruitt's 3rd deployment. I'll now ask Chaplain Major Russell Boyd, who was present during the action in question, to read the citation into the official record." The room settled the way a room settles right before something it already half suspects is important. I did not look at Pat in that pause. I looked instead at the flag beside the stage, steady in the recycled air of the community hall. I let myself breathe once, slowly, the way I'd trained my body to breathe before every hard thing I'd ever had to stand through. I thought, in that small pocket of silence, about every version of this moment I'd imagined over 14 years without ever quite believing it would come. I had pictured it as a mailed letter once, opened alone at my kitchen table, no one else the wiser. I had pictured it, in darker moments, as something I might never receive at all, misfiled forever, one more small injustice a soldier learns to carry without complaint. I had never once pictured it exactly like this, a folding chair beneath me, my own family 2 feet away, my father's letter waiting in my jacket pocket for the moment right after. Chaplain Boyd cleared his throat once, a small human sound in all that formal quiet. Glanced down at the page in front of him. I saw his eyes find the date first, the way a man reads a line he already knows by heart, but still respects enough to read carefully every time. Behind me, I heard Walt Enders shift in his seat, the creak of an old blazer over an older set of shoulders. Somewhere further back, Carol Whitfield's pen went still against her notepad, waiting. The way people wait when they sense a story is about to become more than paperwork. Tradition allows for a chaplain who was present at the action to read the citation himself, rather than the presiding officer. The colonel stepped back from the podium now to make room for exactly that. Nodding once to Boyd as he passed him on the small stage. "It is a small custom," the colonel told the room, "but an old one. The idea being that the person who witnessed a soldier's actions firsthand should be the one to speak them back into the record, so that the words carry weight beyond mere paperwork. I had heard that custom explained once before, years earlier, at a much smaller ceremony for another soldier in another unit. I remembered thinking then how strange it was. An institution as large as the Army still made room for something so personal, inside all its formality. I understood it differently now, standing at the edge of that small stage, waiting for a man who had held a dying soldier's hand beside me. He would be the one to finally tell my own family what I had never told them myself. Somewhere near the back of the hall, a folding chair scraped softly as someone leaned forward to hear better. A child 2 rows behind Pat asked, in the clear, unfiltered voice children use, "Mommy, is that lady in trouble?" Someone shushed the child gently. I almost smiled at the question, because in a way, I had been in trouble for 14 years, just not the kind anyone in this family had ever correctly diagnosed. Boyd stepped up in his own dress uniform, the same folder from our meeting 3 days earlier tucked under one arm, worn soft at the corners from handling. He set it on the podium, opened it slowly, found me in the row behind my family with his eyes before he spoke, the same look he'd given me across a cold cup of coffee in his small office, the look of a man about to finally say something he'd carried a long while. The room had gone quiet enough that I could hear the air conditioning cycle on somewhere in the ceiling. Pat sat perfectly still beside Mark, her hands folded in her lap, the way they'd been folded at our mother's funeral. For the first time since childhood, I saw something in her face that looked less like performance, more like genuine, uncomplicated attention. On the 14th of June, 2009, Boyd read, then Staff Sergeant Dana Pruitt was serving with a logistics convoy near Kandahar province. Her unit's fuel column was ambushed. The room had gone very still. Despite injury to her right arm in the initial engagement, he continued, and despite a direct order to evacuate, Sergeant Pruitt returned twice under fire. She extracted 2 wounded soldiers who would not otherwise have survived. I watched Pat's face out of the corner of my eye. I watched the exact moment the date registered. The same June that she had spent 2 decades telling people was the summer I went quiet on the family. The summer she'd built into a small legend about my selfishness at every Thanksgiving table since. Her mouth opened slightly, no sound coming out. Her eyes moved fast between the stage and some private calendar only she could see. She was counting backward, the way I'd counted forward for weeks. She was matching a date she'd repeated at 100 family dinners against a truth she was only now, for the first time, actually hearing. She refused further medical evacuation, Boyd read, until all personnel were accounted for and secured. Somebody in the second row started to clap. It spread through the hall the way applause does when it's earned rather than expected. But I was not watching the room. I was watching my sister's face lose its color, one shade at a time. Tyler leaned toward his mother and whispered something I couldn't hear. Pat did not answer him, did not seem able to answer anyone. Her hand pressed flat against her chest, the way our own mother used to press hers before bad news. Nobody laughed, not one person, not even Mark, who had laughed loudest at the barbecue. For actions above and beyond the call of duty, Boyd said, reflecting the highest traditions of military service. Sergeant Pruitt is hereby awarded the Silver Star. The colonel stepped forward with the case itself, dark blue velvet, the metal inside catching the fluorescent light for 1 second before he closed it again, handed it to Boyd to present properly. Boyd read the full citation number aloud for the record, then the date of approval, then quietly, my complete service history, 22 years, 3 deployments. Kandahar Province in 2009, Regional Command East in 2011. A final tour training logistics officers at Fort Drum before retirement in 2021, the same year our father died. Boyd closed the folder. Then he opened a second one, smaller, and looked at me again. "There's one more piece," he said. "A personal item, held for you at your father's request, to be delivered alongside this correction." He crossed the small stage and handed me a plain envelope, the paper gone soft and yellow with age. I recognized my father's block capitals from 3 feet away. Dana. The same word, the same hand, 14 years later, finally in the right moment. I did not open it there. I held it, and I stood, and the colonel asked if I wanted to say anything. I said only, "Thank you for getting the record right." Then I sat back down, beside a sister who had not said one word since the reading began. The ceremony closed a few minutes later with a benediction from Boyd himself. The room rose for a final round of applause that swept across all 3 families honored that morning. Ours included. Though ours, I noticed, carried a different weight than the polite clapping given the others. People I had never met came up afterward to shake my hand, to thank me plainly, the way strangers thank soldiers at airports. Except this time the strangers included 2 members of my own extended family who had never once done so before. Pat did not move from her chair for a long moment after the applause faded. Mark finally touched her shoulder and she stood slowly, unsteady, the way people stand after news that rearranges something load-bearing inside them. "Dana," she said, once we were near the doors, her voice barely above the noise of the departing crowd. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "I tried, in my way," I said. "You were never asking the kind of question that would have gotten you the real answer." She had no response to that. We walked to the parking lot in near silence. The boys trailed behind us with a particular hush. Teenagers get quiet like that when something enormous has happened, something they don't yet have words for. I drove home alone that afternoon instead of joining the small reception Pat had, out of old habit. Already started arranging in her head as a way to reclaim the day as her own event. I told her I needed the evening, for the first time in longer than I could remember. Pat did not argue with me. She only nodded, said quietly, "Take whatever time you need," which was, in its own small way, the first fully generous sentence I could remember her saying to me in years. I sat in my truck in her driveway a while before leaving, engine off, and opened my father's envelope alone. Inside was a single page, his handwriting shakier than the block capitals on the outside, the kind of shake that comes from illness rather than age. He had written it in the spring of 2019, 2 years before he died, long before anyone knew his heart would give out the way it did. "Dana," it read, "I have known what you did in that war since the day the first letter came home describing it. The one the army never finished processing right. I did not tell your sister, because your sister has never once asked me a true question about you in her whole life. I was tired of handing her things she wouldn't use with any care. I asked Chaplain Boyd to hold this, to hold the correction if it ever came, until the day somebody in this family finally understood what you actually did. I don't know when that day will come. I hope I'm wrong and it comes soon. I love you. I always saw you. Accurate, not loud. That's the daughter I raised, and I was never sorry for it a single day. Dad." I sat in the truck a long time after that, the engine cold, the porch light across the street coming on as the evening settled. I did not cry the way people expect a scene like this to end. I have never cried loud. I read the letter twice more, folded it back along its old crease, put it in my breast pocket, over my heart, the way I'd carried other things that mattered more than paper ever should. 2 days later, Gary Sump called me from the town council with the piece I'd been circling without quite reaching. The Bracken Street parcel's second mortgage had gone unpaid for 4 months. The bank's final notice window had already run out 3 days after the Fort Campbell ceremony. A foreclosure filing had been entered at the county courthouse that same week. Separately. Gary said this part carefully, like he wasn't sure he should. The state's Charity Oversight Division had moved Carol Whitfield's routine review into a full, formal audit of the Marlowe Veterans Memorial Fund. The same audit Pat had already been warned about days before the ceremony. I had not made either call. I want to be plain about that, because a man like Mark might assume I had. Did mutter as much to Loretta at her kitchen table the following week. I had not needed to. Fear does its own work once it starts moving. Pat's early push for gala donations, the same push Loretta had mentioned over a grocery cart months earlier, had already drawn exactly the kind of attention a hollow set of books cannot survive on its own. 3 weeks after the ceremony, the foreclosure notice went up on the door at Bracken Street. A bright yellow sheet stapled below the mail slot where I used to leave notes for my father as a girl. Pat called me that evening, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "They're saying I have to be out in 60 days, she said. "Dana, I don't know what to do." I did not gloat. I want that understood. Because there is a version of this story where a different woman might have let her sister sit in that fear a long while, might have savored it the way Pat had savored 22 years of small public corrections at my expense. That was never who I decided to be, not at 19, not at 44. "Come by tomorrow," I said instead. "Bring the fund's paperwork, all of it." She came the next morning, quieter than I had seen her since the funeral. Laid a banker's box on my kitchen table, the same kind of box she'd once handed me to carry out of a locked study. I went through it with her for 3 hours. Some of what I found was carelessness, the kind any overwhelmed volunteer accumulates over 6 unsupervised years. Donations logged late, receipts filed wrong. Some of it was worse. Numbers moved from the fund's account into the mortgage payment more than once. Always, she swore, with the intention of paying it back before anyone noticed. "I was going to fix it," she said. "I was always going to fix it." "I believe you meant to," I said. "Meaning to isn't the same as doing it." I told her then about the photographs on my phone, the 3 pages I documented weeks earlier in that same study. She went pale all over again, differently this time. The pale of someone realizing a sister she'd underestimated for years had, in fact, been paying attention the entire time. "You knew," she said. "This whole time, you knew, and you didn't say anything." "I wasn't ready to say it in a kitchen," I said. "Some things need a room bigger than that." "You already stood in one." I did not turn her in to the state review myself. I did not need to. That review was already moving on its own schedule, drawing its own conclusions from records that spoke for themselves once anyone bothered to open the box. What I did instead was co-sign the paperwork for a storage unit on the edge of town, so that when the house sold at auction the following spring, Pat's tools, her son's childhood furniture would have somewhere to go besides a landfill. I did not do it for her, not entirely. Our father built half of what was in that garage with his own 2 hands, over 30 years. Some things deserve better than a dumpster, whatever the person who inherited them chose to do wrong along the way. The gala that October happened without a fun chair for the first time in 6 years. Run instead by a small volunteer committee, Carol Whitfield's office helped assemble on short notice. It raised less money than in years past, but it raised it honestly, every dollar accounted for. Gary told me the relief in that room was its own kind of quiet victory nobody announced out loud. The state review concluded 3 months later with a repayment plan rather than criminal charges. In part because Pat cooperated fully once the choice was between cooperation, something far worse. In part because the amounts, while real, were smaller than the county had first feared. Roughly $11,000 total once the vendor invoices. The diverted donations were added together. She agreed to repay it over 18 months, working double shifts at a dental office in Clarksville, a job she took, without complaint, the week after the auction closed. The house sold at auction the following March for $39,000, just enough to satisfy the mortgage, the back fees, leaving Pat with almost nothing from a property our parents had built a life inside for over 40 years. She moved into a rental 2 streets over from where I live now, a small duplex not unlike my own. For the first few months, neither of us spoke much beyond the necessary logistics of an ordinary week. I helped her move that final weekend, more out of habit than anything either of us discussed openly. We packed the last boxes from Bracken Street together, Mother's china wrapped in newspaper, Father's old fishing tackle, a box of photographs neither of us had looked through in years. Pat stood in the empty living room a long while before locking the door for the last time, running her hand along a door frame our father had built himself. She said, so quietly I almost missed it. I always thought this house was the one thing in this family that couldn't be taken from me. Turns out I'm the one who nearly gave it away. I didn't answer that directly. Some sentences don't need an answer, only a witness. I had learned, over 22 years, one long overdue citation, exactly how much weight a person can carry simply by being present for someone else's hardest truths. That changed slowly, the way most real changes do, without a single dramatic scene to mark the turning. Pat started calling on Sundays, small calls at first, 10 minutes about nothing. The weather, the boys' grades, a recipe she'd tried and burned. I answered every time. I did not make her earn it back in installments, though I understood plainly. That trust between us would take longer to rebuild than any house ever could. 3 months after the auction, she asked if she could come by on a Saturday. She arrived carrying a small box of her own, not banker's cardboard this time, just an old shoebox, the lid taped shut with yellowed tape that looked like it had sat unopened for years. I found this going through Dad's things at the storage unit, she said, setting it on my kitchen table. It's got your name on the bottom. I never looked inside. Figured it wasn't mine to look at. Inside were photographs I had never seen. My father at a veterans reunion event I hadn't known he'd attended, standing beside a stranger in a Legion cap, both of them smiling in a way that suggested a good conversation had just happened. On the back, in my father's block capitals, a single line. Met a man who knew Dana's unit. He called her a hero, told him she was my daughter. I sat with that photograph a long while, the same table where I'd once spread out Pat's fund paperwork, now holding proof of a father quietly collecting evidence of a daughter he was determined to eventually vindicate. One photograph, one conversation, one carefully saved envelope at a time. He talked about you differently than he ever let on to us, Pat said quietly. I think he knew, long before any of this. I think he just decided the truth needed the right room. He was patient enough to wait for it, even after he wasn't here to see it happen. He was, I said, patient enough for both of us most days. Pat asked, that afternoon, the question she'd never once asked in 14 years. What was it like? June the 14th. I don't need all of it. Just some of it, if you're willing. I told her some. Not all. Some things a person only tells once, fully. I had already told the truest version of it to a room full of strangers in dress uniforms who understood without needing the rest explained. But I told her about the smell of diesel, about going back the second time, about waking up in Landstuhl with an arm I hadn't noticed getting hurt. She listened the whole way through without interrupting, something I could not remember her doing for me, ever, in our whole lives together. Halfway through, she reached across the table and took my hand, the way she used to when we were girls crossing a parking lot together. She held it there quietly until I finished, not saying a word, just present in a way she had never once managed to be for me across 4 decades of shared holidays, half shared history. I built a story about you, she said finally, because it was easier than admitting I didn't know the real one. I'm sorry, Dana. It took losing the house to make me stop and actually look. I know, I said. I watched you figure that out in real time, in a folding chair at Fort Campbell. I'll take it, even now. Late is still something. I did not tell her that everything was forgiven, not fully. Not in one Saturday afternoon over a shoebox of old photographs. Some debts take longer to settle than a single conversation allows. I was no longer in the business of pretending otherwise, to her or to myself, but I told her she could keep coming on Sundays. And she has, every week since. 10 minutes turning slowly into 20, into an hour. Some weeks. The two of us relearning a language neither of us had bothered to practice in longer than either would like to admit. She asked me once, a few months into those Sunday calls, whether I still had my father's letter. I told her I did, kept safe in the same footlocker as always. She asked, hesitant, if she could see it sometime, not to keep, just to read once. The way I'd finally let her hear a small piece of June the 14th. I brought it the following Sunday. She read it twice at my kitchen table, the same way I had. When she finished, she set it down carefully, both hands flat on the table beside it. The way you'd set down something you suddenly understood, you'd almost lost the chance to ever see. He always did see you, she said. I think some part of me always knew that. I just didn't want it to be true, because it meant I'd have to ask myself why I never saw you the same way. You're asking now, I said. That counts for something. Walt Enders stopped by my duplex not long after the ceremony, a six-pack in one hand, the same unhurried patience in his walk that I remembered from 100 mess halls. Figured you might want company that wasn't blood, he said, setting the beer on my counter. 14 years is a long time to carry something alone. Even after it's finally out in the open, the carrying doesn't stop all at once. We sat on my back steps a while, not saying much, the way two people can sit together and let silence do most of the talking. He told me Delgado had called him the week after the ceremony. Having heard about the correction through some veterans network neither of us fully understood, wanting to know if it was true, if his old sergeant had finally gotten what she'd earned. Told him yes, Walt said. Told him it took 14 years, but yes. What did he say? Said his kids ask him sometimes why he walks with a limp, Walt said. Said now he's got a better answer than he used to. Said thank the sergeant next time you see her. I sat with that a long moment, the evening cooling around us, thinking about a man in Kentucky with 3 kids. An old wound. A story about a sergeant who went back twice. A story that had traveled further. Mattered more than I'd ever let myself fully believe while I was busy just trying to survive the week it happened. Loretta called that same week, apologizing, unprompted, for every small laugh she'd ever joined in at Pat's expense, mine included over the years. I didn't know, she said. None of us knew. I keep thinking about all those Thanksgivings, all those times I laughed along because Pat laughed first. I never once stopped to ask if it was even true. Most people don't stop to ask, I said. It's not always meanness. Sometimes it's just easier not to. I want to do better, she said. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I want to try. I told her that was enough, for now, and I meant it. Change rarely arrives all at once in a family. It arrives the way mine did, in Sunday phone calls, shoebox photographs, a niece or nephew finally asking the right question at the right time. Carol Whitfield's office, in the months after the audit concluded, used the Marlowe Fund's case, anonymized, as a teaching example in a statewide training session for small nonprofit boards, a case study in how early intervention, honest cooperation can resolve a problem before it becomes a prosecution. Gary told me a woman from a fund 2 counties over reached out afterward, having heard the broad strokes of the story, asking for advice on straightening out her own board's books before anyone got hurt worse than Pat had. I never learned that woman's name. I liked, all the same, knowing that something painful in my own family had quietly made one stranger's mess a little easier to fix. Gary Sump told me, months later, that the compliance office had also quietly tightened its review process for every small veterans fund in the 3-county area, adding a simple annual disclosure form that hadn't existed before Pat's case surfaced. It was a small bureaucratic change, the kind nobody notices unless they go looking for it. But I thought about Evelyn Marsh, the widow with the cane from the ceremony, about every other quiet fund chair in this part of the state managing donations with good intentions, no real oversight. I found some comfort in knowing that one family's hard year had left the next one a little safer. Tyler asked to see my medals a few weeks after that, laid out properly on a folding table the way I'd once laid them out to check against an inspection card. He held the silver star case a long moment, careful with it the way you'd hold something you'd only recently learned was precious. Coach was right, he said, about the toughest guys he knows. Toughest guys and gals, I said, and he laughed, the good kind. The kind that comes easy once a person finally understands who they've been standing next to the whole time. His younger brother Cole asked if he could hold the silver star too. I let him and showed him how to cradle the case flat in both palms, the way you'd carry something fragile and important at once. He asked what it felt like, winning something like that, and I told him the truth. It never felt like winning. It felt like finally being seen for something I'd carried alone a long time. I keep my father's letter in the footlocker now, folded beside the citation itself. Dana written on both in 2 different hands separated by 14 years, but somehow saying the exact same thing. I take it out sometimes, not often, maybe twice a year. The way I've always done with things that matter more than the ordinary run of days requires. I still eat standing up at family barbecues when there are family barbecues left to attend. Nobody calls me washed up anymore. Nobody in Marlowe needed to hear it twice. Boyd calls every few months just to check in. That's how it goes sometimes for people who share a single terrible morning. They stay bound to each other for the rest of their lives. He told me last time we spoke that Delgado's oldest daughter wants to enlist next year. Delgado asked him, half joking and half not, whether Colonel Pruitt might be willing to write her a recommendation letter someday. I told Boyd yes before he'd even finished the question. I think about that a lot these days, how a single ordinary sergeant's decision, made in about 4 seconds beside a burning truck, kept quietly rippling outward for 14 years and counting. A soldier's daughter deciding to enlist. A widow's fund finally run honestly. A sister finally asking the right question at the right table. None of it announced itself as important at the time. It only became important later, the way most true things do, once somebody finally slowed down enough to notice. Carla at the dry cleaner still presses my dress uniform twice a year for the 2 formal events the local Veterans Association holds. She still tells me, every time, that it's the only outfit that makes a person stand up straighter without trying. I believe her more now than I did the first time she said it. Some things about a person only become visible once the right stranger says them plainly enough to be believed. Last month I fixed a neighbor's smoker before he even knew it was running hot. I didn't say a word about it. I never do. I set my plate down, same as always, at the little gathering Pat hosted last Sunday in her new backyard. It was smaller than Bracken Street's. No room yet for a smoker of her own, just a folding table and two mismatched chairs, bought secondhand from a yard sale 2 streets over. Tyler mowed the small square of grass himself that morning, unasked. It was the same quiet way I used to fix things nobody else ever noticed needed fixing in the first place. She caught my eye across that small yard, raised her glass. Not sweet tea this time, just water. Said only to Dana, with none of the old edge in it, none of the performance. Just a sister finally looking at another sister the way she should have looked all along. I raised my glass back. I didn't say anything clever. I didn't need to. 22 years in uniform taught me that the truest things rarely need very many words at all. I set my plate down on her new folding table, and I let the quiet do what it always does. It settles, and this time it stays settled between us both.